cool. Test. Shiny.
Okay.
All right. So as I said, I'm Silas Cutler. We're CrowdStrike as a senior security researcher. Malshare, which is a public alternative to VirusTotal, which is free for people who do malware analysis, and Project 25499 and the RTONA project. My contact information is below. And before we get started, I'm actually going to make a quick note about attribution, just because the term has been slightly misused lately, and I just want to clarify before I get started. And despite the slight unprofessionalism of it, I'm actually going to directly quote Wikipedia on this. In social psychology, attribution is the process by which individuals explain the causes and behavior of events. The causes and behavior of events. Attribution theory is the study of models to explain these processes. So when I mention some things today, and if I say something is from China, it's not necessarily to say a boogeyman in a corner. It's to say, based on the things we see and the motivation that we believe is behind something, we attribute it to this country, and things like that as well. So, and by understanding the who, we can understand the why, and vice versa. So, as well, if you have any questions, feel free to shout out. I talk fast, and if I skip over something, please let me know. So today we're talking about an adversary that CrowdStrike has been tracking for some time that we call Gothic Panda. It is definitely one of the more advanced adversaries that we track. We believe they're Chinese in origin. The big hallmark that we've seen with them is a piece of malware or remote access Trojan that we call Perpy. In any of the cases that we've seen Perpy used, it usually is predicated by the use of zero-day exploits in Internet Explorer. Usually these are use after free vulnerabilities, taking advantage of sort of deprecated scripting languages that Microsoft is phasing out. And this group has been seen hitting everybody from governments, financial organizations, research groups, higher education, and some of the other researchers track this group as Clandestine Fox, which I believe is FireEye, UPS, Perpy Team, and Dell SecureWorks tracks it as TG0110. So, in order to understand the group, starting from an external perspective, it's always good to look at the malware first. So the malware Perpy, Microsoft, if you go by the generic AV name, it's Win32 Perpy Gen A, and there's Gen A through D. This is a little tough to read. It's rated as a severe piece of malware. They say it was first seen on tax day of 2011. From my research, it dates back to 2009 in its first usages. And even possibly before that, based on another piece of malware, which I'm going to cover in a minute. There's some speculatory reports that say it goes back to 2006, 2005, but that's unsubstantiated at this time. Since its use in 2009, it's undergone numerous changes to both control protocols, analysis, anti-analysis features, and some functionality as well. It communicates with control servers through HTTP requests, so standard web protocols. And one of the most key characteristics that people focus on, and what I've always looked at for when I'm looking at this malware, is a unique string encryption methodology that it uses in order to hide sensitive information. So when they have things like control servers and sprint paths, these are actually encrypted and retrieved using a string index identifier. So when I said that malware goes back to 2007, it's based on a malware called DreamClick, or DreamMon, as some antivirus vendors call it. Chinese adware malware. When you're infected with it, what happens is in Internet Explorer, it will inject JavaScript into each of the pages you visit. Ideally, this is probably to do something like push pop-ups on people or redirect them to other sites. Not necessarily the type of thing you'd see in sort of a targeted espionage campaign. Very limited sample base. I think I've only ever found 4 samples of it, and even there I found 4 control servers. Just like Perpy communicates using HTTP requests. And the biggest overlap, the 2 overlaps that is the OS fingerprinting, which if you look at it in IDA Pro, it's 1-to-1 identical. There's no actual difference, but I felt like it was kind of a weak link. But the strong link is this really unique string encoding methodology. And as I said before, fairly limited samples. I only found 3 or 4 control domains. And when I actually started looking at this, I think in 2013, all of the domains had expired. So somebody had been running this malware for a while, decided that they didn't feel like paying the bills anymore to the hosting or the domain registrar, and let the domains expire. So like any rational person, I registered the domains and sinkholed them. In the time of, I think, the year or 2 years which I owned the domains, I only saw about 50 unique victims that were total. Plenty of malware sandboxes running the samples, just seeing what the malware does. But it was only about 50 infected hosts, which when you're looking at the scale of like targeted campaigns, 50 is an okay number, because that's a pretty small base. When you look at like criminal malware in a sinkhole, you see thousands of victims. But so 50 was like, okay, maybe this is something targeted. But when you start looking at the victims at the individual level, these are residential IP addresses, small companies, not something you'd be expecting. So I've generally come to the conclusion that this is something kind of criminal in nature, and not necessarily the full-featured espionage malware that Perpy is. So over time, this malware, if we start with Dreammon as the original code base for it, evolved into what I call Perpy Classic, which is the general remote access Trojan. From there was a light version, which acts as a dropper for it. And then there's more versions which started appearing in 2013, which include Perpy 2, which has updated control protocols, Perpy CLI, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. And in recent months, there's been Perpy 3, which has additional, more anti-debugging, anti-analysis stuff, as well as some post-exploitation tools. And the biggest thing with all of this is they all share several code overlaps, and the most important one being this string encryption methodology. Here's just a breakdown of what I just said. So Perpy Lite usually acts as a dropper, but the one I'm talking about quickly is the post-exploitation tools. So I've been told actually Mimikatz has been packaged by this group into its own custom little PE file. Still, same PE, same string encryptions used to hide sensitive strings. Excuse me. So in 2013, in one of the campaigns that they were running in which they were leveraging a Internet Explorer 0 day, when you actually were infected by it and exploited by the vulnerability, you'd see Perpy Lite dropped, which would then unpack Perpy v2 and Perpy Classic. And the idea behind this was it was likely so that if one of the implants failed to run or was detected by AV, they'd be guaranteed a foothold initially because of one of the implants. And both of these were configured with different control servers so that even if network controls were blocking it, they'd still have a better chance of gaining access. So Perpy CLI, or command line interface, I really, really like. This is a really nifty tool. It's generally the same malware. There's not a lot of changes, but what they did was instead of embedding control information, so if you've done malware analysis before, you'll know that somewhere within the file will be the domain or the IP address the malware is going to connect out to. So rather than doing that, they changed the idea. So instead of working like that, in order to run the malware, you actually have to statically say, here's the IP address you're going to connect to, here's the port, and here's the C2 key, or the key that you need to be able to authenticate with the control server. And this actually makes analysis much more difficult to a degree for researchers because control server information isn't embedded in the file. So when you're doing incident response, and you find the file running, and you pull it off, great, but you still don't have things like domains, IP addresses that are being connected out to, server keys, and things like that. So a lot of information is lost by simply shifting where the control information is placed. One of the other advantages to this as well is I've started believing that this is being used once the adversary is actually in the network. So he's actually already begun post-exploitation, is already pivoting through the network. And has anybody ever tried to, already been like 4 or 5 hosts into like a pen test, say, and had to push down a new like PE file? It's fairly difficult. It's not something you can just copy and paste in most cases. So what happens is if they're within a network, it can be speculated that if during their post-exploitation they encounter, say a situation in which they're being blocked, maybe the domain gets blocked that they're connecting out to, an IP address is blocked by a firewall, rather than recompile a new binary, they can simply remove the configuration, push a new one down, and have a better chance of being able to exfil the data from the network. Moving a little quickly. Does anybody have any questions? All right. So April 2014 was sort of the last massive campaign that people saw publicly. I mentioned to you before the phishing email that they had. This was a phishing message that was actually sent out to a non-government organization mailing list. Very clean, very professional, and a lot of sort of the clunky phishing messages that everybody gets. There's blatant things that you can look for. There's spelling errors. There's time frames that don't make any sense. Whereas this one was sent out on April 25th, in 2014. Calendar invitations for an event on May 18th, so it's timely, it's relevant. It doesn't share a lot of the hallmarks of traditional phishing. So it's something, despite its simplistic nature, it's well crafted. And it tells users, if you're going to submit a calendar entry, here's a link. Submit them on this webpage. And actually, for being a calendar submission, the domain they used was Sweeney Photos. So it's even relevant at the domain level. So this was sent out April 25th. It triggers a vulnerability for CVE 2014-1776. And actually, the following week, Microsoft issued a patch for it out of band because it was such a severe vulnerability. So the domain I mentioned, SweeneyPhotos.com, is actually out of Pennsylvania. I called the guy up who's in the Whois information and asked him and said, hey, I'd like to talk to you about your domain. Explained the situation to him, said, hey, I'm seeing this used in a series of phishing campaigns, and I'd like to talk to you and get some more information. So I gave him what I had, and I never heard back. Unfortunately, I'd really love to have seen some of the stuff he has on his site to see if he had any files left over from the adversary. But it looks like at this time that's passed. But what we can learn from this is that they're probably using compromised infrastructure. So when they're running a campaign, there's probably a period of time beforehand in which they're popping boxes that they know likely are related to what they're going to run the campaign about. Targeting infrastructure within the US, that way if you're blocking, say, I'm going to block everything from country XYZ, it's likely you're still going to trust hosts in the US. So CVE 2014-1776, the way they have it set up is that when a user hits the landing page, loads a JavaScript file which does a check for Internet Explorer, because if you're not running Internet Explorer, you're not going to be vulnerable. It then opens up a Flash file. Flash file does another check for Internet Explorer, hands control back to the JavaScript file, which does a heap spray, and then returns control to the Flash file, which sets up the conditions for actual exploitation and delivers the final shellcode payload. What was interesting is the versions of IE that are checked are actually different. So what's been happening is in the 2013 campaign that they ran, they were actually using the same files, but they've just slightly modified them for 2014. So the important thing with this is it's likely that they're reusing the same tool set. It's probably because it's a small, well-crafted group. And actually, the final payload that's delivered from the exploit is actually just a GIF file. Does anybody play Half-Life? Gordon Freeman? All right. Yeah. So it's just a simple GIF file, but when you apply a hex 75 XOR encoding, you find that there's actually a full PE file within the GIF file, which is what's deployed. And that's actually a copy of Perpy 3, which is sort of the latest version that's been deployed as a first stage implant by this group. So let's talk about attribution and what do we actually think about this group and we believe it is behind this group. So generally we consider this an advanced adversary, and this is based on use of zero-day exploits. If you're running a commodity criminal enterprise with one of the common exploit kits, you're not necessarily developing your own exploits. You're using things that are already out there, already possibly commercially available. I mean, maybe even in some cases privately available. But for this group, these are exploits that are likely developed either in-house or purchased prior to usage, and are not known before the campaigns. Additionally, they use a unique piece of malware. This isn't used anywhere else. Things like Zeus, you can go out and pick up on GitHub, actually. Now I think there's a copy floating around on there. So there's actually a skill level required. So they have to have both development of malware development skills. They have exploit development skills. And over time, they've even made it so that the malware is even more difficult to analyze. So in cases, in the early versions, there's very basic things. So for people who've done malware sandboxing and behavioral analysis, usually what happens is you'll run a piece of malware in a safe environment, say for about 5 minutes, and record any changes. So to evade this, they started including things like sleep for 30 minutes. While that may seem really basic, it makes it so that for the bulk processing of malware that a lot of people do, you miss this. And it's just a file that, it ran, but it didn't do anything. So over time, though, they've set it so that it'll do things like basic VM detection, and things so that if you open it in tools like IDA Pro or Ali Debug, it's just going to make your life incredibly difficult to pick through it. And as well, the things like the string encoding make it so that just basic tools like strings don't produce really unique things that you can pull out without doing full-fledged malware analysis on it. the big bear in the corner of this being, it's likely Chinese in origin. And I say this kind of slightly. When you look at DreamClick, definitely a Chinese piece of malware. All the control domains are with whois information. They all link to a location in the financial district of Beijing. Many of the victims are Chinese, so it was likely a criminal group in China doing this. When you look at the PE language resources as well, they're all Chinese. With Perpy, there's still a couple that have that Chinese language set that says the person that compiled this file was using the Chinese language set. If you also look at the phishing messages, they all have a timestamp for the time zone offset is Chinese Standard Time as well. So these are not conclusive links, but they are things that paint a picture of it likely being an adversary based in the People's Republic of China. So one of the big conclusions that I definitely have about this group is I actually believe they're working as a contract service. So for people who've studied Chinese intelligence in the past, it's not quite how it works in the US. It's a little bit more outsourced. There's a lot of different groups doing this on behalf of the Chinese government. With this group, if DreamMon was an adware malware that they were selling for ad clicking or pop-up banner or affiliate programs, it's usually a financially driven thing. And seeing that malware evolve from, seeing the malware they're using evolve from a simple adware malware to an espionage tool, it's likely that while the tools may have changed, the actual motivations may have stayed the same. And they may be operating this as a financial thing. As well, when you start to see really broad targeting of things like governments, higher education, banking, activists, things like that, it's definitely possible that they're soliciting their services to people who are willing to say, we need information on these groups and performing that. I also believe it's a fairly small group of people. I don't believe that it's a large team. Originally, I believed it was one person, and I have a quick anecdotal story about that in a second. When I originally researched, I thought it was one person. I believe that the development and it all kind of fit that it might be a single person who's cared for this malware over time. Another thing that they have is sort of what I consider like a unique knowledge management system. So that from some of the stories that I've been told by incident responders is that when they've been in a network and they've been pushed off and they come back even a year later, they'll try and do ping checks for hosts that they know about on the network without doing any Nmap scanning or some of the wide reconnaissance that they do. So they know, even a year out, we know that we touched this host last time, I want to see if that's online. This could be basic checking to say, where am I on the network, or am I in some sort of sandbox? So they do those checks. Back to the single operator theory for a second. There was a story I heard from a fellow researcher who told me that when they were dealing with the adversary on the network, they were doing a man-in-the-middle screen capture, and there's a fantastic presentation from Context IQ, I think it is, where they do a presentation to show how they were actually man-in-the-middling the remote desktop session for this adversary. Highly recommend it. It's a black hat video. And what happens is when you watch the adversary work on a system that they have access to, it's incredibly clean. They know what they're doing. This is something they've done numerous times. And when they make a mistake, and in one of the screencasts they showed, the adversary triggered something which instantly said that, popped up a message that said, the system needs to reboot. There's been a critical error. They didn't panic. They removed the tools that they had. They removed the configurations. They removed their backdoors, and they rebooted the box. They didn't panic. They were very swift about it. There was a counter story I heard to that a few months ago where the adversary was on the network and they were bungling the usage of their tool. They couldn't get the command line syntax right for Perpy CLI. They were misclicking files, and it just wasn't what people have come to expect. And the exact line that they used was, "Come on, man, you're better than this. You're better than this." And for when an incident responder says that, I just couldn't help but laugh about it. And finally, they've got a very static modulus operandi. They're always using the same tools. They've reused things. They've evolved things over time, which almost seems like they have maybe even a limited set of resources. So they're not going out. They're not buying new pieces of malware. They're not buying 5 or 6 different exploits at a time for these things. It's very singular in operations. They run one campaign at a time, and they're pretty consistent about that. Questions? I know I'm a fairly fast talker. So. Yes?
So, what's your best explanation of how they were completely typed one time and flopping the next? Do you think this malware is getting out somewhere? Is someone co-opting the infrastructure, or do you think there's
So the theory that I was coming down to was that it's possible that this started as a single person or a very small team, and as they've gotten larger and as I guess the industry has evolved, even here in the US with our security companies getting larger, it's possible they're hiring people now. And they're bringing in new talent and putting them into act as operators as well, so that they've got multiple people and can actually start eventually doing multiple campaigns at the same time. And it's possible that this was a junior level person. As Paul Asadorian says in the beginning of his podcast, give the intern control of the botnet. So that's generally my theory on it. Any other questions? Yes.
What do you see as the takeaways for all of us for defending ourselves against these malicious attacks?
So in an adversary like this, there's a lot of challenges with it. And even some of the best companies that are out there and ones that have extremely high security budgets are having problems with this adversary. A lot of times, actually, and the things I'm recommending these days are going back down to, or the basics in some cases. Definitely perimeter controls. So the adversary, one of the things that they've implemented since the very earliest beginning is they can actually use proxy authentication, and they can, or basic proxies and proxy authentication. So if you're doing things like running a network proxy, which requires authentication from all your users, you still need to be doing things like deep packet inspection and analysis of that traffic. Despite the sophistication of the tool, all of the variants are using things like the HTTP protocol. So there's still the signature detection on that. And despite people saying signature detection is dead, it still will catch this. With the binary protocol they're using, they've started wrapping it in SSL to try and block that. But if you're doing things like SSL inspection and SSL termination and checking this, you're going to catch it as well. So despite the sophistication of tools, they're still using that. So I definitely recommend perimeter control. And as well, like I said, the adversary is fairly fast moving. When they run a campaign, the campaign is going to get caught if it's using one unique enough exploit. So being on top of things when the new campaign comes out, I'm not going to suggest patching because everybody knows about patching, and it's not necessarily something it's not something possible in this case. Because if you're using an exploit that's not publicly known, and Microsoft hasn't even patched it yet, you've got to have ways to fix that and deal with that. So perimeter controls are always, and then you can always go with the basics as well. Phishing in this case is always something that's going to happen. So, any other questions? Yes.
So does phishing only work with IE?
Yes. So the exploits that they're using are only IE. So I mean, if you're company-wide not using Internet Explorer and that's your standard, it's going to negate a bunch of these things. Or at the very least, it's going to force them to do something different. And like I said, they've got a fairly static modulus operandi. If you force them to do something different, that's a good chance for them to make mistakes. It's a good chance for anyone to make mistakes. If you've got to do something new, it's a way to open them up to do something in which they can be detected. Or it's a way for them to allude to another ability that they may have. So if they start, say, using like an exploit kit, something like Scanbox, that's another way you can start detecting them, is if you force them to do something out of their ordinary. So, anything else? Oh, yes.
So one more just to go over the microphone.
All right.
The use of public CLI implies that they actually have to be interacting on the blocks at the time.
Yes.
Which means it scales with the labor and not the processor, right?
Absolutely.
So we expect them to get sloppy over time as they continue to train up new people?
That's what I suspect as well. And if you've got to manually configure it on the command line, you're going to have to be able to. It's also implying that they've got to. Let me start over on that. So it's possible that what's going to happen is they're going to have to start splitting out teams, right? Like any organization. Once you start to get big enough, you have to break down into teams. So we may start to see a time in which they're using a group of people dedicated for initial intrusion, and then you start to have other people that are operating as for post-exploitation and doing this post-exploitation, and they may be the ones mainly using the CLI variant. With that case where they were fairly sloppy, it was such an absolute difference. And I highly recommend the video from Magpie. Because one of the things they did was they had to move a PE file across the network, which is kind of a daunting task. So what they did was they base64 encoded the entire thing, pasted it into Outlook Express, saved it as like a .eml file, opened it up, and then just saved the attachment off of it. And that was the backdoor they used. So, I mean, that's a pretty nifty technique. But it's possible that as they start bringing in new people, some of those techniques may be lost, or they may start to develop new ones. So, yes?
The lower skill level, I guess, that
Sure.
operator that you saw, was there any indication that they may have been operating from like a script, like here, do these things in that order, or was it somebody that in those interactive seemed to actually have some clue what they were doing, sort of?
So it's very interesting because there's a lot of operators who do operate on a script. And it's been seen pretty regularly where some of the other adversary groups, like they clearly run through the following steps. In that case, in the case of that operator, it seemed a little bit like they were told what they were supposed to be doing, but it seemed like it wasn't completely crystal clear and it wasn't line for line verbatim. So, and a lot of things with this group have never appeared that way. There have been some things, it looks like they may have some automated stuff so that once they do land a box, they may have a set of scripts they run just to do like a quick profile of the system. But once you're in the post-exploitation phase, it doesn't look like that's really an automated thing, and it looks like it's almost a very hands-on approach. Anything else? All right, I guess that's it for today. Thank you, everyone.